Hello everyone, welcome to the CEFC Green Room. Today we're exploring our latest research report, Opportunities for Cutting Embodied Emissions. My name is Michael Russo and I'm your host for today's webinar. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the respective lands on which we all meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those who don't know me, I'm a director and co-head of our property team at the CEFC. Last week, the CEFC released a new report for Australia's buildings and infrastructure sector on the opportunities for cutting embodied carbon, which you can find a link to in the resources section of the webinar portal. As a specialist investor in the clean energy sector, and in particular property and infrastructure, we are constantly working with investors, asset owners and developers to cut emissions right across our built environment. Over the years, we have focused our investment activities on reducing operational carbon across these sectors and believe now the market is well advanced in that area, with net zero targets being set and achieved and pathways being well defined. We're now turning our attention to tackling upfront carbon and the role that plays in our investments moving forward. Some of our recent investments in this space include the Road Highway Logistics Park in Kwinana, WA, which is using low carbon concrete and achieving up to 40% emissions reductions as part of their pathway to target carbon neutrality through the construction of the precinct. Another is the residential project at Northcote Place in Melbourne, which is reducing its concrete emissions by 30 to 60% across their dwellings. More information on these transactions can be found on our website. What we found through this process is a lack of transparent data and benchmarking capability for the market to make investment decisions off. So we were pleased that this report not only included practical guidance on reducing embodied emissions in projects, but also found that you don't have to choose between sustainability and savings. Today, I'm joined by two industry experts to delve into these findings a little further. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Anne Austin, Head of Sustainability Australia at Lendlease. Anne, did you want to quickly just briefly update everyone on your background?
Terrific. Thanks very much, Michael, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm lucky enough to be coming to you today from Camaragal land and to pay my respects to any elders past, present or future who are on this call today. I would describe myself as a Lendlease lifer, so I've been there nearly for 30 years, straight from architecture school. And I've had a mix of project and people roles in that time, in my time in Lendlease. And the last 15 years, I've been working in sustainability, both at a Lendlease group level and with Lendlease Building. I've recently just taken on the role as head of sustainability for Lendlease Australia as part of a restructure that's happened within the Lendlease business, where we've brought all of our businesses together under one CEO in Australia, which we're really excited about because, particularly from a sustainability perspective, being able to be at the very beginning right through to the very end, we know that we can have make a lot more difference being across that whole value chain.
Perfect. No, thank you for joining us today, Anne. We also have Monica Richter, who is a Senior Manager for Low Carbon Futures Program at WWF Australia and the Project Director at Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. Monica, I might hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of the land that we're all on today. So I guess I'm a sustainable cities and carbon specialist, been working in the area for 20 years now. I support the Science Based Targets initiative here in Australia. I've helped to establish the Business Renewables Centre, an impact procurement model to help corporates and councils to procure renewable energy through power purchase agreements, and recently helping to establish Mecklers, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, which is very exciting. And I also sit on the board of ASBEC, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council. So thanks.
Thank you for joining us as well, Monica. So before we get started, we have some short housekeeping. Today's formal session will run for about 30 minutes, followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A. You can ask questions in the Q&A box on the screen, and time permitting, we'll attempt to answer your questions we have at the end. As mentioned, a link to the report can be found in the resources window. At the end of the webinar, a questionnaire will appear. We would appreciate your feedback to improve on our future events. Well, let's get started. So as a bit of background, in this report, embodied carbon firstly is described as the greenhouse gas emissions that occur during the resource extraction, manufacturing and transportation to construction site of the materials, also known as cradle to construction site. The analysis for the report was focused on two key areas. Firstly, how recent infrastructure and building projects have reduced carbon based on data from Infrastructure Sustainability Council and the Green Building Council of Australia. And secondly, how new projects could adopt material and design initiatives for reducing embodied carbon and the cost for implementing them. What was found was, on average, a sustainability rated infrastructure projects assessed are achieving up to 33% reduced emissions in their embodied carbon. For the building projects, the average reductions are up to 15%, although some individual projects were significantly higher, which can be seen in the report. Importantly, cost-effective solutions are available today to substantially reduce embodied carbon. Depending on the initiatives implemented, it is possible to achieve 5 to 18% reduction in your embodied carbon, whilst also achieving a 0.4 to 3% reduction in the material costs for typical building and infrastructure projects. The key initiatives for cutting embodied carbon emissions, on what was found in the report, while saving costs, include precast concrete, low carbon concrete and engineered timber. So let's get into some Q&A. So I might warm everyone up a little bit, but asking a pre-COVID question. So pre-COVID, what contributed more to global emissions, air travel or embodied carbon in building materials and construction? So this is one just for the audience to have a bit of a think about. So obviously we're here to talk about embodied carbon, so that's obviously the right answer. But embodied carbon in building materials and construction represents around 11% of global emissions. Aviation represented around 2.5% of global emissions in 2018, obviously pre-COVID. We might roll into the query. So the research identified several material and design initiatives that can cut embodied carbon whilst reducing material costs. Was that surprising to you, or what you had envisaged? And given your Lendlease's focus on this for some time, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so firstly I want to say congratulations to the people who prepared the report. I've already been using some of the groovy graphs that were in there. There's some terrific analysis in there. This particular piece around the cost, there was elements that were surprising and elements that were not. We have at Lendlease been working on trying to reduce our embodied carbon, as you mentioned, for some time, and there are certain materials where we have got to a point with alliance partners where there's no price premium for the low embodied carbon alternative, so particularly for things like cement mixes. And so obviously also things like dematerialising, stripping out materials, there's a cost saving that's involved with those. So it's never been for us something that it's a given that it's going to cost you more. However, there are a number of low and no embodied carbon alternatives now that do have a price premium. So I looked a little deeper into that chart that was prepared in the report, and I realised that they were talking about the cost per tonne of carbon that was saved, and that obviously some materials you save an enormous amount of carbon, and therefore on that cost abatement curve they sit under the line. Unfortunately, until we have a price on carbon, the market and the people that we're working with don't view the alternatives that way. They are simply saying, well, if I use this type of cement versus this type of cement, which one's cheaper? Because there isn't at the moment a cost associated with the carbon, that cost per tonne of carbon saved hasn't come, into that conversation. So we're still at an immature discussion around the costs in relation to materials, but we're starting to see our, friends overseas being in a very mature conversation as they start to move more rapidly towards pricing the carbon in the embodied carbon stage of the construction journey. So some of it surprising, some of it not.
No, interesting. And just on that point, I guess there's two roles to play. Obviously, the behavioural change in an organisation. So you mentioned putting a price on carbon. Obviously, Lendlease are well advanced in this space. Is this something you're seeing getting more traction and more progression in the market, where the internal drivers and behaviours are being manage through setting those internal prices?
Yeah, I mean, we price carbon. We have a shadow price that we place on carbon in our investments as we work through them, and we're not alone in that. That's a common practice, but it's a shadow price. It's not a real price. If there was some sort of clear signal to the market that placed a price on carbon, I think it would be a lot. The transformation of this sector would be far faster. Even if it was a legislated requirement for reduction, even something that actually stipulated that this is a non-optional, at the moment it's still driven largely by organisations' own desire to reduce their carbon footprint. But that desire is really consistent. And I think we might come to that later, where we're seeing some of those drivers come through. This was a conversation that was not happening probably even 2 years ago. I mean, when we worked with WWF on our paper around barriers to low and no embodied carbon uptake, we were amazed at how many people actually turned up to listen to us talk to what we found. So I think we are definitely at that over the cusp of the tipping point. The conversation has gone very, very quickly.
Yes, no, that's absolutely something that we've been experiencing as well. Monica, maybe over to you. Is this aligned with your work with Meckler at the moment?
Yeah, I was really heartened to see how many case studies were in the report, Michael. That really demonstrates that there have been some significant shifts in the marketplace around embodied carbon. One of the things that was outstanding for me was that fundamental issue around dematerialisation and design optimisation. We don't talk about that very often. But, to be able to see that pre-design phase, even before you start the construction, the importance of the collaboration of the different parties coming together in that pre-design phase is going to provide and drive those significant savings. And I'd love to find a way, how do we make that business as usual? So it's not just your, showcase projects, but that's going to be a fundamental driver for that change. And I think what Meckler is able to do is to bring those parties together to identify that as one of the key critical elements of success. And hopefully we will see that BAU in the next period of time.
No, absolutely. And it's an interesting point, because ultimately a lot of these strategies, it needs the least cost pathway transitions into the being a cost-effective strategy. So how do you integrate that behavioural change and get that movement and occurring right through the value chain, and whether that's trying to get organisations to make upfront carbon reduction a success factor right from the start. So when you're procuring, when you're designing, as part of that day one sort of target, is it putting an embodied emission reduction piece as part of that work stream?
Yeah, we often talk about, time, cost, quality as the traditional elements of success, but if we include carbon in there, those are the 4 ingredients for driving this forward.
Absolutely. So you're both seeing different perspectives across the supply and demand drivers in this space. I have probably a 2-part question here. What are you seeing as the key drivers behind the interest in cutting embodied carbon, and what else should be done to take this further? I might kick this off with you, Monica.
Yeah, so I guess the first element to this is companies setting science-based targets under the initiative and having to really think about their carbon budget, setting medium-term, now near-term targets, and Scope 3 emissions. I mean, it's a whole new way of thinking about the carbon problem, the need to work with your supply chain to drive those emission reduction targets. So that's definitely an area that I think is driving that. The ratcheting up, from well below 2 now to 1.5, sense another set of urgency around how you solve those issues. And then, what else do we need to be doing here? I mean, I really support the need for us to have a price on carbon. We are starting to see, the fundamental role that government, an activist, engaged government plays, not just be able to set the longer term and medium term target, but also the procurement agencies. And another element that sometimes we forget is the importance of behaviour change. And, speaking to Holcim's sustainability manager yesterday, and he was saying that, they're one of the 5 global companies now that have set a net zero standard through the SBTI, and they're having to take their whole organisation on the journey to understand, make every decision count. So it's not just the sustainability team or the treasury team, but, you've got your people on the, in the business who are having to think about the decision to change a new technology, your boiler or whatever it is in the business that they're driving that change. So I think behaviour change is going to be a fundamental part right across the business as well.
It's a very good point, and as I touched on earlier, a lot of the work we undertook and are continuing to undertake in the operational phase really focused around that behavioural change. The technologies in that space and the pathways are well defined, but a lot of the sort of the difficulties is really about getting right from the executive level down to the asset level and decision-making level a consistent approach and consistent thought process with these things. So part of the challenge isn't necessarily proving up the cost effectiveness of it. It's how do you actually integrate that structure into the organisation so you can get those key outputs. And I might switch over to you, given you're coming at it from probably a slightly different angle with Lendlease and dealing with investors and demand drivers there.
Yeah, so we've seen an enormous increase in expectation from our investors and from our clients, particularly government. So, 5 years ago, we would never have seen a brief for a project that had an embodied carbon expectation in it. We now routinely have embodied carbon targets embedded contractually within our briefs, which is really fantastic, and that drives significant behavioural change across the whole market. So anybody out there who's an investor, ask the question if you want to make a difference. Simply actually requiring this as one of your must-haves makes an enormous difference. Even just asking questions of the entities that you're investing in as to what their approach is to embodied carbon has a trickle and flow-on effect. So silence is deadly. We need to keep talking about it. The more we talk about it, the harder this agenda is driven. We're also seeing things like the evolution of Green Star tools that now, and ISCA, that bring into play embodied carbon requirements, also drive behavioural change. To achieve a level of excellence, you now have to have met certain targets for those tools, which is then has that flow-on effect of organisations picking that up. I would like to think that what's driving it is a commitment globally to wanting to live in a world that's only 1.5 degree warmed, and the conversation around that is much, much louder. COP26 played a big role in that. Trump being replaced by Biden played a big role in that. Like, this is a global phenomena that's happening. A lot of our clients and investors are global players, and so I think that, just there's finally some momentum building behind the climate change agenda that we're starting to see means that there's a deeper level of sophistication and an understanding of what impact the building sector really has. Because the elephant in the room has been embodied carbon for a long time. Everybody was talking about, buildings in operation, but as you mentioned in your introduction, we can see the pathway for that. And so now the attention's turning more to embodied carbon. And like Monica, if there were prices on carbon, that would definitely drive this further. Also, I think the other thing that's needed to be done to take this further might be some genuine support for the supply chain who are trying to innovate, particularly in the Australian market. A lot of our peers internationally enjoy different kind of subsidy levels. Not only do we see that with building manufacturing of materials, but even things like renewable diesel. If you're in the UK, there's a subsidy for that, so that when they import it, it's at price parity, which means that a whole market picks that up and runs with it. And so our supply chain here, if there were any kind of mechanisms that would support their innovation, I think that would drive it a lot further. And the other thing that I think is going to be helpful would be some sort of consistent way to measure whether or not you have got low embodied carbon. And that's it sounds easy, but believe me, it's not. Meckler are trying to get their head around this at the moment. There are lots of different options for how you might choose to measure or benchmark embodied carbon, and somehow as an industry us landing on a common language around that will really help us move forward. And I know New South Wales Government are looking at introducing an embodied carbon aspect to the neighbours tool that might take us some way towards that, but I think it's going to be pretty important.
Transparency, and we saw it in the operational phases. The more transparency and more benchmarking that was available to the market, the quicker that progression occurred. So it's really about, bringing it to the forefront, not mandating it, but having it part of these rating tools. Obviously, the work that GBCA are doing under their Green Star for buildings rating tool is very important and a really good first step in terms of getting project proponents to think about this and measure it. But you're right, it is in its nuance phase, and there are different lenses that are being applied. So having that consistent approach is also very important. And on the supply demand drivers, similarly, we've experienced very progressive discussions with tier one builders, with material suppliers, that they're doing a lot of R&D. They're doing a lot of work. They can see this coming. And some aspects just need a little bit more market demand to be evidenced so that progression and expansion can continue, and then some of those technologies and materials that are probably a little bit more cost prohibitive probably come down the cost curve a little bit. And I might keep it with you at the moment. So with Lendlease's international footprint and the Mission Zero commitment for absolute carbon by 2040, which was announced early in the year, I believe, what are some good examples you've seen in other countries that Australia could consider or should consider?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we've committed globally to being absolute zero carbon by 2040 with all emissions, including Scope 3. We've done that deliberately because Scope 3, accounts in any given year for anywhere between 85 to 95% of our footprint. Now, that includes some elements of Scope 3 with our tenant electricity, but the lion's share of that is our materials related Scope 3. So we can't really say that we're on the journey to 1.5 degrees if we ignore that. You've got to think about embodied carbon. But what we've found, interestingly, though, is that there are two markets that are running faster than the others, and that's the Australian market and the UK market. The UK market is ahead in terms of the expectations on builders in that market. But we shouldn't be ashamed of what we're doing here in Australia. The embodied carbon outcomes that we've had at Lendlease in our Australian projects are as good as, and in many cases more advanced than, some of our international examples. What we do notice is different, though, is the supply chain. So there are more choices overseas of low embodied carbon options for steel and aluminium. So a lot of the materials that we use in our buildings here in Australia to achieve the lower carbon alternatives are still imported, while the Australian market starts to get its head around, recycled steel and electric arc furnaces and hydrogen options, etc., recycled aluminium, blah, blah. So that's kind of where we're seeing a bit of difference. And there's a lot of policy differences that are happening in Europe. Their carbon border tax, which I think is a cracker, that they're actually going to really start to think about their importations and whether they're up to their standards. So those things I expect are going to push those markets to be significantly ahead of where we are and put a lot of competition on what's available out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Really good insights. And Monica, maybe have you seen anything thus far with the work that Mecklers doing from an international as opposed to domestic front?
Well, we're about to undertake some policy work to actually have a look and scope out what's happening internationally in the best practice policy levers to help drive this. We certainly know that our cousins across the Tasman Sea, they've got a procurement policy in place looking at whole of life carbon for the building and construction industry. They introduced this procurement guide in June this year, so we can probably learn something from them and learn some of those lessons from them as well, and how you accelerate that. The UK, as Anne said, they've got a requirement for constructors looking for any tendering project greater than £5 million, companies need to be able to demonstrate what their net zero plan is for all scopes. So, I think that will be a game changer for building and construction in the UK. You've got Denmark, for example. They've got a 70% by 2030 target, and they have a ratchet up mechanism looking at CO2 emission reductions 2023, 25, 27 down to 2030. So they're putting very high expectations. So I think we can learn from different overseas examples what works best, and see how that can help to contribute here. I mean, New South Wales government, who's provided some of the funds to help kickstart Meckler, they've got their low embodied materials program, and I think that it's that combination of having government that's this very activist, hands-on government trying to drive this without driving sort of regulation, and you've got industry coming on board. We're seeing the shift, neighbours wanting to look at embodied carbon now. We've got some way to go before we land that, but I think that we'll be able to drive that. And even, the Victorian government has their Ecologic program because of the challenges with China not taking Australia's waste, which is the right thing to do. So it's, sort of provided an incentive and drive to be looking at more principles around the circular economy and how do we convert the waste to be able to be used, so that we're creating that circular piece. So, I think it's horses for courses. The Australian building and construction industry has always been a leader and will probably continue to lead, and we'll do it in a different way as long as we've got all parties at the table sort of trying to drive that and accelerate that.
No, absolutely. And it brings up probably another interesting topic there, Monica, is views on technology and innovation and how that should be applied to the sector in Australia. Is it more weighted towards that? Should there be more of a balance towards proven technologies that are already in place and cost effective? Is it even mix of both? What's the view there?
Well, I guess I come at it from the point of view of the sense of urgency. If we're going to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, I mean, every percentage of a degree matters, and we have to decarbonise the economy quickly. We're looking globally to reduce emissions by 50%. So that's, it's a huge task for us. Here in Australia, we've got the challenges around having to decarbonise, our steel manufacturers. It's relatively straightforward for your electric arc furnace where you've got recycled timber, but more complex for your blast furnace, where BlueScope is. But their, recent announcement with Rio Tinto to be looking at exploring hydrogen options, I think is a really exciting proposition for us here. And, certainly the various iron ore majors, Fortescue Metals and so on, they're looking at future industries and future opportunities. Certainly the cement and construction, cement and concrete industry are also driving innovations there. They launched their decarbonisation pathway recently, and there is an expectation that carbon capture, usage and storage will play a significant role. I think they set up to 33% of their emissions, which is quite a considerable amount. So we need to find ways to make these technologies proven at scale, permanent. We can't afford to allow the CO2 to after 100 years to go into the atmosphere. So that those are all technological hurdles that we're going to have to overcome. And technologies around direct air capture and so on are things that we're going to have to explore as well. They're all technologies that the IEA, International Energy Agency, has said we're going to have to use if we're going to achieve those things. So I am all open for looking at the technologies that are going to best accelerate this, as long as we look at reducing those smartly. And I guess the other element of excitement for me is thinking about the circular economy. And we import a lot of high quality polymers from different parts of the world, and we could be using and converting the waste stream in Australia to be manufacturing some of these polymers for utilisation in our construction industry, your green metals, your plastics, and so on. And there is a whole opportunity of industry. These industries are micro factories that can be located in regional Australia, to be creating and rethinking new jobs, and the use of 3D printing to be able to rethink this. So, the opportunity is endless for us. I think we just have to continue the conversations, create spaces where we can explore this and start really driving this forward.
No, absolutely. And Anne, over to you. I think there's obviously a lot of cost-effective solutions available now, which was highlighted in the report, and Lendlease is sort of living and breathing this through their projects at the moment. So what's your view on this balance?
Of proven technologies has been our massive handbrake as a sector. We are super conservative for good reason. We don't want buildings to fall over and squash people, right? So there is an enormous conservativity to the way we think, and that has resulted in us building in pretty much the same way forever. So actually introducing new materials into a project is extremely difficult. We get specifications from our customers that actually stipulate the exact mixes of cement that we can use for precisely this reason. So when you're trying to deviate from that brief with an alternative that hasn't potentially been tried before, we are not set up for that conversation, and we need to change. We need to be set up for an entirely different conversation that says the only thing we have proven with the way that we've built before is that building is detrimental to carbon creation. And so, if we actually want to prove that we can build and survive as a species and stay under 1.5 degrees warming, we need to be open to different ways of building and different material types. And that's a really tough space to play in, because we also have to be 100% safe. And so it's how are we going to be, testing new materials and alternatives rapidly so that we feel confident that we can use them quickly. And Australia is slow. I mean, even things like geopolymer concrete, which has been proven over and over again and used all throughout Europe, we still don't have recognised in our Australian standards. So if you want to use that product, you have to go out on a limb and have an engineer who will be prepared to sign it off. These are all little barriers that mean that we just are going to stay in proven technology land and never go into the new way of building, which is we need to transform. So we've got to be open to that. I think it's a huge challenge.
Absolutely. And I suppose bringing it back to an asset level, one project that I was really impressed with, and I've walked through myself as part of the report, but walked through when it was completed was 25 King Street in Brisbane. So given that the report obviously noted that on average 15% emissions can be achieved in projects, but there are some that are quite a bit higher, that project was one that was highlighted. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit in terms of what Lendlease found.
Sure. Well, you're very lucky if you got a tour of 25 King. The timber buildings are always beautiful to walk around, and that's actually really, really important. I always say to people, something beautiful has much more chance of staying around and not being demolished later on. So beauty is part of the embodied carbon story for sure. So 25 King is one of about a dozen timber buildings that Lendlease has built now here in Australia. It's one of our taller ones. It's a 9-storey building, commercial building, made of cross-laminated timber and glulam in Brisbane. And the timber was a key part of the story for that building to attract both the tenant, Oricon, and the owner, the Impact Investment Group. So timber actually became something that attracted them, and that low embodied carbon story was added huge value because that tenant and that buyer came to the table around that agenda. So I think that for us was a really interesting finding, because when we were starting to build this, there was uncertainty about how the market would react to the timber product, but they, reacted very favourably. And depending again on how you calculate the embodied carbon in relation to timber, if you include the amount of carbon that's captured actually and stored in the timber itself that's sequestered within the timber, you get up to about a 74% reduction in that building. If you don't include that, it's still just under 40% saving. So there's huge advantages from an embodied carbon perspective to build in timber, but there's also an enormous range of other advantages. Timber is quiet to build with, and we've actually found from a mental health perspective, for the workers were not frazzled by, the jackhammer kind of noise and the reverberation that you get in a concrete building, and it actually made a big difference to their well-being. You can have smaller teams, smaller equipment. It's obviously prefabricated, so you can bring it into site and assemble it fairly rapidly if that's important for your project. And the other thing is it's a lot lighter. So we've had a couple of instances, 25 King and the library that we built down in Melbourne at Docklands there, that needed a light frame structure because of the nature of the soils there, and so you can get significant advantages. So it's really definitely one to be looking at. We did try valiantly to get geopolymer to also be part of the story. We were trying to figure out if we could do our piling using geopolymer, and the first slab that we have to do in concrete to stop the termites, we were trying to do that in geopolymer. We couldn't quite get that one to crack, so that's the next timber job. We need to do that hybrid piece, and I think it will be that hybrid of as green as we can get steel, timber, geopolymer, putting them all together. But well worth a look. If you're up in Brisbane, go and have a check out of 25 King.
No, absolutely, and I do get a sense, and you're seeing a lot of projects now sort of coming to market, which is that hybrid type structure. Obviously, the Atlassian building that's been much talked about, but there are a lot of other sort of assets that are allowing timber to expand into other sort of building typologies and expand its sort of use in the property space. So I think that's really important. Monica, I might quickly finish up with you prior to getting over to the audience, some of the audience questions. But what's Meckler doing to help the industry tackle embodied carbon?
Well, Meckler, we have the privilege of having 115 founding partners from right across the different parts of the building and infrastructure supply chain, including the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and Lendlease. And, we've seeking to collaborate to help accelerate what is already happening in the industry, to advance the uptake of low emissions technologies, and particularly to address some of those barriers. We looked at it from a systems point of view, what are the main interventions that we need, and we call ourselves a do tank. So when a founding partner comes on board, they get involved in the various working groups that we've established. And for example, as chair of working group 1, on the demand side. So, how are we going to accelerate the demand side there, through policies, other initiatives, prerequisite pledges, and so on and so forth. We are looking at the benchmarking tools. What are the best practice tools? There's still, some ambiguity out there to be able to do that. The knowledge sharing piece, being able to bring people on that journey. We had a spotlight event on steel yesterday, really important to be informing the industry on what's actually happening, the challenges, but also those opportunities for partnership. The common language specifications is fundamental to it, and then we're looking at the material supply. So it's, the demand side, supply side coming together for that conversation. We get a lot of feedback that's a game changer for a lot of organisations, particularly on the supply side. And I guess the other is that we have government right there. Queensland has come on board, the Department of Infrastructure. We've got South Australian Department of Infrastructure, New South Wales government as well. And, having the government agencies at the table with industry, talking and collaborating is a fundamental part of our success in being able to drive this forward. So we're hoping, you know, our collaboration will continue for at least the next few years. We're not going to be around forever. We're going to be around until we solve some of these issues and direct them. And, you know, we're really grateful for all the support from all the folks that have been part of our collaboration so far. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important initiative and one that we need to see through to keep the momentum going. We might flip it over to a couple of questions from the audience, and there's been a bit of a consistent theme here. I think, Anne, you've triggered a few queries, but there's a lot of interest around shadow carbon pricing and that side of things. All good, but just around obviously it's a key. It is one of those key strategies to start driving that behavioural change in an organisation. So how does an organisation that probably is still grappling with it, how do they get started in terms of raising the importance or the role of implementing a shadow carbon price? And the other piece that's coming through is the decisioning priorities of the shadow carbon price. Is it solely around if a material is cost effective and it has carbon benefits, then that's the priority, or is it a balanced approach where shadow carbon is sort of just layered into the decisioning framework on projects?
So we embarked on the TCFD journey a couple of years ago, so the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. I would highly, highly recommend that to any organisation. So TCFD is a scenario planning approach where you consider the potential warming futures, be it 4, 3, 2, 1.5 degrees, and you imagine your business in that world and work through what are the risks and opportunities related to that particular warming scenario. We found that incredibly useful and very educational, and through that journey the organisation was pretty clear that they wanted to back a 1.5 degree future. It became very evident to us that the others weren't particularly nice. It was off the back of that we've then started to look at the potential that one day there will be a price on carbon in this market and anticipating what that might mean for our project. So as part of our investment rigor, we cost things like a shadow price related to if you were having to offset your emissions, and we also cost in 100% renewable electricity, so purchasing RECs or something along those sort of lines. And at this stage, we're learning how to do that. So we haven't got this nailed at all, but we're starting to say we need to at least start to measure that and to be able to assess what are the implications so that we are ready in the case of there being a legislated price on carbon, that we have got things that are set up in place to enable us to routinely consider that in our investment decisioning. But it also, brings to the fore the importance of trying to find commercially viable ways to address these things. So I was literally in a meeting the other day where we were looking at what would the cost of this particular fund that we're starting up having 100% renewable electricity, and it's quite expensive for us to be able to achieve that, and so it automatically makes you start to think of, okay, well, should we be developing our own solar farm? Would that be a more appropriate way to do that? Is the PPA angle? Like, it opens up this whole discussion, and I think that's the point of doing the shadow pricing and doing that analysis, is it just makes you think. And if you don't even look, you're never going to start to wonder whether there's a way to commercially address this. So we're just starting to try and kind of push ourselves to be commercially savvy in decarbonising.
No, I think it's a really important step, and one that to get that behavioural change, you need those tangible topics and outcomes that you can measure against, and having something like a shadow carbon price or reporting on TCFD just to look a little bit more strategically on how organisations sort of operate with their decisioning is a really important process. Monica, maybe over to you. There's another question from the audience, and obviously the top end of town, the tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3 sort of engineers, construction groups, etc., are getting quite progressed. They're hiring internal sustainability teams and consultants to come on board to to help on how they deliver these outcomes in a lower carbon world. What advice would you have for small to medium enterprise? Obviously, there's probably not access to the resources in this space, but obviously you're a very important part of the solution if we're going to move as a whole down this path.
Yeah, absolutely. So for SMEs and smaller builders and organisations, I've had a few conversations with them over the last 6 months. It's often the young, passionate people who are advocating to join Meckler or get involved and engaged, and coming on board the journey, learning. That learning piece is really important. There are for SMEs, there's a few things that organisations can do. They can join. There's an SME, the Climate 2030 Race to Zero program that they can join. They can set Scope 1 and 2 targets, and then they work through their Scope 3 emissions profiles. I think they really need to join, whether it's the Green Building Council or the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, are running these masterclasses on embodied carbon, and upskilling is important, and being able to advocate to the CEOs and of the organisations and the leaders of the organisations to see if they can get there, because if they don't, they will be left behind. I think that's really important. They need to be educating themselves and coming on that journey together. And I'd be very happy to support those organisations as well through the Meckler process as we move forward into next year.
And Michael, can I just add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's lots of things that are free. So all of our TCFD scenarios are published on the Lendlease website. So you don't have to, if you don't have to pay the consultant or whatever to work all that out. So there's enormous amounts of resources out there. That the investor group on climate change. There's a huge amount of wealth of information. The Sustainable Supply Chain School. There's really there's a great little website called Climate Weirding, which has a whole series of little modules around climate change. There is a plethora of information out there to self-educate without having to necessarily invest in making it yourself, doing it yourself.
No, some really, really good points there, and I think it's it's really important. Obviously, the industry has a big part to play. General consultant groups and investor groups and asset owners collectively, I think, have to all have a focus on this for that momentum to get accelerated, because the movement's already started to occur. It's just about getting up to speed and doing it consistently and really accelerating the progress that's been made. Well, look,
we're all on that journey together. Yeah,
we are absolutely. Look, that probably wraps it up in terms of time. Look, thank you, Anne and Monica, for joining us today. It was really, really good insight across all facets of the market, and really appreciate the conversation. Thank you to the audience for dialing in. Hopefully it was insightful and you got a lot of pointers. There's obviously a lot more information on our website, and there'll be more information coming. The recording will be made available after the webinar if you want to listen over it again and get a couple of those good points. And also, please remember to complete the survey, which will appear at the end on the screen. So thank you very much.
Thank you.